I'm going to go to one of the first questions that we have. And Chantal, I'm going to ask you first, how does the Nutri-Score system compare to the Peru system? Are you familiar enough with the Peru system to be able to answer that question?
No, I'm not completely familiar, but I think it's a warning system based on nutrients, just as the Chilean system, or am I wrong? Lorena. Yeah, so it's basically they're very different. The Nutri-Score gives an overall assessment of the nutritional quality of the foods, whereas the warning systems provide an estimation by nutrients. So first, this is a difference, and then even in the criteria, the Nutri-Score is going to include also positive elements in the food, fibers, proteins, fruit and vegetables, while warnings are specifically targeted to unfavorable nutrients. So this is a first difference in terms of what does the Nutri-Score address versus warning systems. And then there's the format system. The Nutri-Score is basically color-coded, and though black is still a color, I understand, we are going for a multi-colored label with green and reds, which are really readily interpretable. And this is also one of the difference between the two. And I really think that the two dimensions, either nutrient-based or summary labels on the one hand, and the question of colors versus monochrome, are really two elements that need to be taken into account when developing a system, because that's where you see the difference between various schemes.
Would anybody else like to make a comment on that one before I move to the next question? Let's try and keep our answers as brief as we can. There's more questions coming in. I would like to ask Mary, when you had the Canadian system up, the symbol says high in sodium, sugar and fat. I presume that in sometimes it'll just say high in sugar or high in sodium. Whereas actually the way you presented it looked like it was always the three. Would you like to clarify?
Yes, Mike, you're absolutely correct. There is space for all three nutrients of public health concern, although a food may only have one of the nutrients identified if that's the one nutrient that's of public health concern. We're led to believe, though, that that nutrient will always be in the same place on the front of pack system. So if it's high in sodium, the sodium would always be in the same place, even if it's the only one.
I wonder if, I'm not sure that everybody can see the questions. I presume they can. Mike, I noticed there's a question for you in particular. Oops, now we've lost it. And so, but I do take the point, the last question that's come in, that you mentioned that label, format and nutrient profile are two separate elements. Should there be a third element, a regulatory and governance structure?
Yes, we should. I think it's an important question whether the scheme is going to be mandatory or voluntary. For starters, I would prefer mandatory schemes over voluntary schemes. I think it's also important who designs the scheme. I think it should be the responsibility of governments to come up with both the underlying nutrient profile model and the design features. So I think we need to consult with industry over design in particular, but not particularly over the nutrient profiling model.
Now, I'll move to another question, which is what about point of sale? We are talking about on packaged food. Is there any country that we're aware of that has moved to point of sale warnings as well?
Not that I know of. I think there have been some tests done in store using point of sale elements instead of putting directly on the food, but not specifically on the effect of it. The idea was that the on-shelf tag was a proxy for having it on the food at the time, because for logistical and organizational elements, it was really complicated to have tag on each of the single foods, but I am not aware of any specific study going for on point of sale warnings.
And when we discussed the Health Star rating, and I was heavily involved in the development of that in Australia, we looked at fruit and vegetable and whether you would put the Health Star rating, almost all fruit and vegetables going to get either 4.5 or 5 stars. And where you would have them stacked in a supermarket, you might actually put it there. We have seen 1 or 2 examples of that happening, but really it has been always designed and presented for packaged food.
Michael, I know that Coles, one of the supermarket chains in Australia, looked very closely at actually putting it on their ticket, which has the price prior to the introduction of Health Stars in Australia, but they ended up changing their mind at the last minute because the ticket was too cluttered.
It is also one of the options that's being considered in the current review. In fact, there's a document out at the moment with many options to improve the system, and one of them is to have 5 stars on all fruit and vegetables. But just going back to the question about warnings, I understand that Finland has warnings at point of sale on high salt or high sodium food, and has had for many years as part of their cardiovascular disease reduction program.
And Mike, this is Mary. In Canada, of course, our front of pack warning system are not implemented now. We do already have several of our grocery chains who do use a shelf tag with a star rating type system, or a happy face, a variety of those, and many of them appear on fruits and vegetables and healthy foods with multiple stars. We also don't forget that New York City introduced the salt shaker on menus for foods that exceeded the UL for sodium on their menu labels. So that's one example where a warning label is actually on a menu, and it's required in New York City.
And look, there are also some requirements in Australia for identifying how many calories or in the food at fast food stores and so on. And I think that's happening in other places worldwide. One of our questioners has asked, what about positive nutrients? How many systems include those? And certainly the Health Star system, as Cleona explained, is a balance between negative nutrients and positive nutrients. And she says the Finland heart symbol, does use fibre as one of the criteria. Are they going to be used in Canada, Mary? Then would anybody else like to comment? We'll go to Mary first, then to Jill, then to Chantel.
As it currently exists, the program that's been put forward in regulations in Canada only focuses on the 3 negative nutrients. The rationale that has been put forward is there is already a high proliferation of the positive attributes on foods that are being promoted by the food industry from a variety of claims and front of pack voluntary systems such as whole grain stamps. And so the idea is that the front of pack, a warning type system, would then counterbalance to also focus consumers' attention towards the negative nutrients. So the positive are already there in about half of foods, and this would then counter that by focusing on the negative nutrients, which are not customarily shown on package by the food industry in the front of pack systems that they use.
Chantel, can I go to you, then to Mike, and then to Lorena?
Yeah, well, basically the Nutri-Score uses the same basis for the nutrient profile as the Health Star rating system. It's basically the Ofcom model, so it also takes into account favorable nutrients. And I think within the elements that we haven't discussed, which are the endorsement schemes that appear only on healthier foods, that have, just like the keyhole or the choices system, usually they do take into account some favorable elements, but more generally it's proteins and fibers.
Lorena, a similar, because yours is just focusing on negative, I think that's the warning labels.
Yes, in Chile, we have positive claims, healthy claims, and nutritional claims for many years. And it's really not enough information for consumers. Then now we added warning label to help consumers to best buys and good choice. And we think that both systems can be complementary, positive and negative, but it's very important to be clear with consumers because, for example, in Chile, traffic light with 3 colors, green, yellow, and red, is very confused for them. They can't decide if one product is good or not, because one product can have red for fats and green for fiber, then it's very complex to decide it. Then, because our studies, we finally decided to put only one color and one logo for warning critical nutrients, because this is our problem now too. This is a big problem for us. Then we put it and focuses on this problem.
Thanks, Lorraine. Now, Mike, I wonder if I can go to you to answer the same question, but also throw in another one. So it's about positive nutrients on the one hand, but we've also had a question about why not include additives and preservatives. So I wonder if you can touch on that at the same time, please, Mike.
Yeah, I think the best schemes take account of both positive and negative nutrients, and that's why I think Health Star Rating and Nutri-Score are better than the best types of schemes around. And also, they are on every packet, or they should be on every packet, and you could make them be on every packet mandatorily. In theory, things like traffic light labeling could have positive nutrients in the scheme. So you could have a light for fiber as well, but generally it's been thought that that would make that scheme very confusing. So that's, again, I think a reason, as a sort of a minus sign against traffic light labeling. Ideally, I think we need systems which take account not just of health, but also of environmental sustainability. And again, you could adapt many of these schemes to bring in considerations of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, in relationship to foods. I don't think I would go as far as including additives within the nutrient profiling model, because I don't think there is huge benefits or not enough scientific evidence to suggest that additives are really bad for your health. But I do think we need to think about the underlying criteria in a broader way than we have done hitherto. And in particular, I think those underlying criteria should take account of environmental sustainability and not just human health.
Just before you go, Mike, there was also a question on added sugar versus total sugar. And I know that there's been a serious number of submissions to the review in Australia advocating for using added sugar as a measure rather than total sugar. You have a view on that, and then I'll go to Chantel with that one.
Yeah, I think if you're going to look at the overall healthiness of a food, it's the added sugar that matters much more than the total sugar. So I do think we should move towards schemes which are taking account of added sugar rather than total sugar. The Americans have already agreed that they should have added sugar on their labels. So I think other countries should follow suit in that regard. And also, that means that front of pack labeling should be added sugar, not total sugar.
Thank you, Chantel.
Yeah, I'd like to interject on 2 points on the question of should we add additives and preservatives, because it's a really huge question by consumers in France. There's a large push towards, well, limiting the amount of additives or preservatives that are used in the food industry. And the question here is much more a question of scientific knowledge. We do not have enough evidence, enough knowledge of how much do preservatives and additives impact health. We do have lots of work on sugars, on saturated fats. So perhaps in a few years, we'll be able to include these within a label. But the problem is that we need to be consistent on what does it mean. If it's a question of health, we also need to have very consistent elements with scientific knowledge. And for now, for additives and preservatives, it's not there yet. And then on the question of, should we use added sugars? There also have been questions, I think also in Australia, about the question of free sugars or added sugars versus total sugars. I think both are very interesting because they're giving more information and discriminate foods in a more consistent way rather than total sugars. But the question is also a question of transparency. We're using labels to inform consumers. And one of the key issues is that consumers do give a very high importance to transparency. If they're not able to calculate for themselves the Nutri-Score or the label that is taken into account, then it's going to be to undermine its credibility somehow. So if free or total sugars or added sugars are used, it needs to be also on the back of package so that consumers can check and have much more credibility on the label, and then they can recalculate it on their own. That's it.
Chantel and Mike, I think one of the things that you've also highlighted is that we are talking about very complex systems. And whenever we make these decisions, there's always a series of factors that come into it. In fact, I typed a response to the question on preservatives and additives as well, that our decisions when I was with the Public Health Association, I've retired about 3 months ago, was that we focused very much on population health rather than impact on small number of individuals. And that makes a very big difference on how you make your decisions as well. But I'd like to give Rebecca an opportunity, as she's also involved in food technology, to get an industry view on that added sugar, whole sugar, free sugar debate.
Oh, that's a big question, Michael. So look, I think at this stage there is total sugars labelling, which is on the side panel. Yes, added sugars should be considered, but I'm not sure if consumers will really understand the difference between the two. And what I'd like to try to understand is, why do we think that added sugars will ultimately give us a change in consumers' behaviour? What will that highlight to them, and how will that then trigger a behaviour change for them? If we were to make a change at the moment in the Health Star rating system to change focus from total sugars to added sugars, you would not have much change in the Health Star rating system of the breakfast cereals, for example, that we currently make, because the vast majority of them have added sugars that's included through cane sugar. And there are some products like Sultana bran or Raisin bran in other markets where the majority of the sugar comes from the fruit. So it may distinguish between those two types of product. I think also you just need to be careful of the unintended consequences of that, and whether you would push the food supply to wanting to then look for non-nutritive sweeteners, like your inulins, like other long-chain fatty acid, long-chain sugars, or highly sweetened sugars that may then lead to unintended consequences. So I know sugar in breakfast cereals, for example, is added to provide a barrier from the milk getting into the grain and making it go soggy. So then you might, because I saw Mike Rayner screw up his face when I spoke about inulin, we might use inulin as a coating on that food in order to help it stop going soggy. And that might be an unintended consequence of trying to reduce the sugar. So I don't think the answer is simple. If the answer was simple about dropping the sugar out of foods, I think we probably would have done it a long time ago. But my key question for all of us to consider is what will be the consumer behaviour that we think we'll achieve by changing from total to added, and what's the education campaign around that in order to drive a change? So I'd be happy to hear others' points, and I'd be also happy to debate it.
Thanks, Rebecca. We are running out of time. I'm going to give Cleona a chance because we haven't heard so much for her, and ask to come in on a couple of questions. How do you determine the nutritional quality of food based on the nutrition profiling system if it has both good and bad nutrients? So if you can keep your answer brief, and then could you go to that question of dietary guidelines, Cleona? Should we be focusing on the dietary guidelines, and how does that relate? Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to be brief because I'm then going to come back to the answer on the polls, because we now have answers on those 3 polling questions. Leanne.
Okay. Quick answers then. The way you take it into account is by awarding scores for the content of both negative nutrients and positive nutrients, and summing those together and coming up with a holistic score. It's the same way that you do for the Nutri-Score system and for the UK nutrient profiling model. With regards to dietary guidelines, I think it's really important that any front-of-pack labelling system supports and aligns with the dietary guidelines as much as possible. And actually the point I was going to make about the added sugars is that I think that is why it's important to have added sugars as part of the scoring system, because work that's been done shows that the front-of-pack labels and the system then better align with the dietary guidelines. And of course our dietary guidelines are increasingly about added sugar and not total sugar. So we need to get it on the NIP as well as in the nutrient profiling system.
Yeah. Thanks, Cleona. Can I give everybody just a very brief chance if they have a final comment to make? Can I start, Cleona, I'll start with you if you have a final comment to make.
Well, no, I've made my comments. Thank you, Michael.
Chantal?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think all this shows that there are differences in nutrient profiling or nutrient front-pack labels, but it's also because we also have different guidelines. We also have different nutrition problems around the world. So asking for some kind of uniformization of labels, for now, I think it's maybe a bit too early. And once we're decided that we're all on the same page and have the same problems, perhaps we can go to that. But it's normal to have different versions of front-of-pack labels because we also have different cultural background, different highlights, different food offers, very variable depending on the country we're in. So for now, I think the labels have been developed for each of the countries and do reflect the focus of each of these countries on a specific target. And perhaps, well, at least other countries are now considering implementing front-of-pack labels, and they can develop from our experience in these elements. So that's...
Okay, thanks, Chantal. I need everybody to be quite brief. Thanks very much. Mary?
Sure. Thank you very much, Michael. Maybe I'll just add 2 points. I think the important concepts that we're hearing is that the front-of-pack system should be interpreted. In other words, what they're there for is to give consumers the ability to understand and use the information that's more fully provided on the back of package. And I think what we're hoping to see in Canada is the advantage of having a mandatory system. And I think some of the thinking was, for example, the data coming out of Australia and New Zealand, that with a voluntary system, it tends to be the healthier foods, which are the ones that are choosing to use voluntary front-of-pack systems. So the public health objective of a mandatory system really is to help highlight those products where they may contain high levels of nutrients of public health concern. And I think that's an advantage of this type of system we're embarking on in Canada.
Thanks very much. Can I now go to Mike?
Thank you. Yes, I want to just endorse what both Chantal and Mary have said. Firstly, I think it's really important that front-of-pack labelling systems should be mandatory, because that makes manufacturers give us information about the unhealthy foods as well as the healthy foods. Also, I think it is true that maybe there's not a perfect system. Different countries may need different systems. I think in South America, the health warnings are probably important there, where they've got an evolving food system. I think in Europe, something like Nutri-Score will be better than health warnings. And just finally, I think it's important to do something rather than nothing. I'm glad at this moment in history, front-of-pack labelling schemes are beginning to be experimented and spread. But also be careful what you start with. In the UK, we're a bit stuck with traffic light labelling now because we've had it for quite a few years and consumers are used to it and like it. But I'm now sort of slightly wishing that we went for something better like Nutri-Score at the beginning.
Thanks very much, Rebecca.
So I'll just put forward a point. I think it just needs to be part of a bigger system. So I think we need to promote the dietary guidelines. I think we need to promote the guides to healthy eatings about how much and the number of serves people should eat. And front of pack labelling is then the icing on the cake. Doing front of pack labelling in isolation won't get us anywhere.
Thanks very much. That actually answers one of the other questions that has come in as well. So I appreciate that. I think I've covered all of our speakers. Yes. Thanks very much. So I'm now going to invite Marta Lamazzi from the International Office to speak. And just while she's coming in, I'm going to just read the outcome of the poll. So the first question, sometimes public health professionals accept voluntary systems initially, then call for mandatory. Should public health professionals demand mandatory systems from the start? 40% say yes, 69% say yes, 28% no, and 3% no opinion. In seeking to have multiple FOPL systems to suit different social groupings, is that making the issue much too complex? Overwhelmingly, yes, too complex, 66%, but 28% saying no and 7% not decided. And finally, should governments give priority to marketing of national dietary guidelines rather than FOPL system? I may say I'm a little surprised by this one. 33% say yes, but 48% say no, and then 19% undecided on that. So there are still differences of opinion and different things suit different countries.